This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to discuss when good characters do bad. Yeah, so when your protagonist has to do something kind of rotten or maybe even downright horrible, we've got to fit that in with all the wonderful things we know about our protagonist and all the things that make her likable, and decide how we're going to work our readers' emotions through that scene. Is it going to be heavy enough to turn the reader against the protagonist, to resent the protagonist for the rest of the book? Will the protagonist redeem herself or not? There are a lot of issues to play with here as writers. So, all right, that's the introduction, guys.
Well, what do you mean by bad? I mean, do you mean like Jack Reacher sort of, killing the bad guys bad?
No. Oh, no, not when...
morally reprehensible.
Yes, morally reprehensible. Yeah. So what got me thinking about this is, in my current work, Evelyn has been hurt multiple times over since the beginning of the book by circumstances and various people. And finally, she hits a breaking point, and the last straw... Somebody, I'm going to be intentionally vague here because no spoilers on this particular scene here, but somebody who's kind of an innocent person who just doesn't know better trespasses on Evelyn's personal property. And, this is a significant, emotionally important memento. So Evelyn kind of freaks out and lashes out against this other girl. And what she does is pretty reprehensible. So the reader will know all the ways Evelyn has been hurt and everything leading up to this. But the reader will also know that this other girl, Alice, really didn't know what she was doing. And she had no intention of hurting Evelyn, right? So it's... like, is it understandable? Is it excusable? Is it unforgivable? And how do we play with that when we need our protagonist to be human? But, in a really pretty objectionable way.
Well, I reckon it's probably a continuum to some degree. I mean, if at one end they never do anything that's in the slightest bit critical, then you've got the Mary Sue character.
Yes.
And then at the other end, if everything they do is bad, then you've got no empathy and you're going to throw the book across the room. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, I suppose what we're saying is at some point, they probably have to do things that make us cringe, scream, or, no, you idiot, why did you do that?
Right.
And maybe when you first started to talk about this, I was struck by the Stephen Covey's idea of the emotional bank account, and coupling that with Blake Snyder's save the cat moment. So, if you've built sufficient empathy and the reader has enough emotional bank account in a positive fashion with the protagonist, mm-hmm. then although you might go, oh, I would never do that, so there's the vicarious thing of, well, at least I feel better because I would never do that. It's like watching those reality TV shows where all the contestants just do things that are just horrible. And you go, well, I'm glad I don't do that. And it's suggested that kind of social shaming is actually important to us, that gossip is important to us because it makes us feel better about the way we act. So in some ways, a protagonist doing something morally reprehensible, as long as we still can identify mm-hmm. with everything else about them, makes us feel somehow better about ourselves. We think, well, I wouldn't do that.
Right.
So you can kind of, I suppose it depends on where you're at in the story and, mm-hmm. and for what reason, and to what degree is it, can that be forgiven? Mm-hmm. And that's probably at the end of the day subjective down to the reader. If you've got someone reading it who's, say, devout in their faith, and your protagonist commits adultery, for example, then are they going to then go leave a 1-star review? This was terrible. So, to some degree, that judgment about morally reprehensible is subjective and down to genre, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I really like what you said about the emotional bank account, and I think that's useful for us writers to keep in mind is where in the story this event happens, because if you open the book with Evelyn being cruel to Alice, nobody's ever going to like Evelyn ever again, but by the time this event happens, we know Evelyn, we're deeply on her side, we understand all the ways she's been wronged and hurt. So, you know, if I'm doing my job well, I've built up a pretty heavy balance in the sympathy account with my readers.
Yeah.
So then my hope and my feeling as the writer, or my feeling just knowing Evelyn, is that readers will see it coming and go, oh no, don't do it, Evelyn, don't do it.
Yeah,
you know?
Right. Yeah,
And they'll just be caught up in the moment and carried through it with a lot of feeling, but not, you know, sympathy for both girls, not turning on Evelyn along the way.
Right. They're willing already to forgive her in advance. Like they know, oh, something's coming, and then they watch it happen, and they've already given that forgiveness, no matter how long it takes her to sort of give that redemption moment, right?
Right. And is the redemption moment necessary? Would you ever write a scene like that and then not redeem your protagonist? Can you imagine doing that? Or have you read a book where that happened?
Well, I'll refer back to, I've mentioned this before, the Thomas Covenant series. And it's a portal quest, so the protagonist has leprosy, and he somehow manages to fall into a fantasy world, a parallel world where he doesn't have leprosy, and a girl rescues him, and then pretty early on into book one, he rapes her. And she go, oh, it bugged me. I actually, but this is the funny thing, I went on to read all three books. So it didn't bug me enough to stop it, but I just hated him. And I hated him through the whole three books. Yeah, you go and read the reviews for it. You know, people love it. There are people who hate it like I do as well. So I think that's the thing you risk, is if you do it, then you've got to know what you're doing. And, you know, Game of Thrones, I mean, there's an example of an author and who's captured hearts of readers by focusing on perhaps morally reprehensible acts. So, so maybe there's something in the human psyche that will pick up on it, and the three of us we're much too goody two shoes, aren't we? But yeah, Thomas Covenant is one of them, and and I know there are others out there, because in my other life where I'm you know, assisting in writing descriptions for books, you can, some of the synopses, you think, oh, that's a bold move, making your hero do that. And you have to be careful if you're writing a sales blurb for it, that you don't allude to anything of that sort, because that definitely puts off somebody from picking up a book if they don't think they're going to be the protagonist. Right.
And there are those characters who are anti-heroes. But when we aren't an anti-hero, when somebody is a true sympathetic protagonist, but we get to that point where, you know, the only best logical story move is for them to do something reprehensible, then what? You know, and I think that character who commits the rape at the beginning of the series is a great example, because you open the book expecting him to be a hero, right? And then it's a kind of emotional twist for the reader.
Well, yeah, he's definitely a reluctant hero. I think you get that pretty early on. But I was quite shocked, and I was also quite shocked. I mean, there were consequences, clearly, but yeah, it was. I was I was a bit staggered by it. You know? So they go, oh, whoa. So that, for me, that crossed the line. But you know, and I'm a man, you know, so I don't know, you know, for female readers, whether. I think it is a very male-oriented series anyway, so...
Yeah, well...
And,
you know...
Right, but it's like you were talking about earlier, it's like the emotional bank account wasn't there with that character either, because you said it was pretty early on.
It was very early on.
Yeah, and this is what I was dealing with in my short story as well. Like, I have a scene where Everett, my main character, hits the bottom of his, like, character arc. He's hit rock bottom, and you get to see that as a reader.
Yeah.
And that's that moment where he hit that morally reprehensible button. But it's like 3/4 to 7/8 of the way through the story. It's like right before the climax where he hits that point. So you've seen him, he's unlikable in the very beginning. Then you see him start going through this transformation. And when you get that morally reprehensible part, it's in a flashback, so you get to see what he did, but you already know where he's gone or where he's going to. So it's, again, that emotional bank account is there. You know already that he's redeeming himself. But that moment where you kind of like want to hate him, you can't really hate him because you know already where he's going to be by the end of the story. So again, building that bank account to where it's cushioned and that withdrawal doesn't immediately yank your readers from the sympathy for the character.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've seen Galaxy Quest. It's one of my favorite movies. It's so stupid. But
just number two. I missed number one.
Yeah. Alan Rickman is so funny in it. He's really good, and he's this sort of he's a thespian who's had to descend to the level of acting in something like a Star Trek series, right? And it's gotten so bad that they're all basically all they do is show up at Comic Cons, and they've got no real work, and he's so tired of signing things for fans and having to repeat his famous line over and over and over. So he's an eye-rolling character. And he's asked to do something in the movie. It's comedy. It's like a space opera comedy type of thing. And he goes, but what's my motivation?
Yeah.
So I think I'm always reminded of when we want characters to do something that is out of character or is going to cross a line. If you can be inside them and thinking through what their motivation is, and can somehow, without telegraphing that so heavily to the reader, if you've either built up to it or foreshadowed it, or can see that they've eventually snapped,
right?
That in combination with the emotional bank account, I think, gives you permission to push the boundaries of human behavior.
Right.
Yeah, that's another really great point, Robert. I like that. That we need to establish the path that leads to this act, so thinking in terms of why the character does it. In Evelyn's case, she's hurt and she's lashing out, but why this particular girl in this particular instance, there are seeds of, why this girl, why Evelyn doesn't like her, or why she's uncomfortable around her. And another girl accuses Evelyn of being like Alice, and so that triggers all of her discomfort with this person. And, so we need to make sure that the event doesn't come out of the blue for the reader. As much as it makes sense to the plot or to what we're trying to accomplish with the character arc, you still need to do the groundwork of why now, why this particular act or event.
Right.
And,
So even if it's an emotional twist, right? Even if you want your reader to go, you kind of want them to go, I knew that was coming. And follow the through line backwards.
Yeah.
Yes, it's that.
Didn't see it coming, but it makes total sense
hindsight.
Given that character's emotional wound or the journey that they're on. Like if it's a redemption arc or something like that, then some of these things actually might be important, might be key to making your character believable.
Yeah, definitely. What else goes into?
We should make our heroes do bad things then. I think it's. I'm warming up to this now.
oh, we're converting you.
I think it's interesting to talk about bad things versus mistakes. Like, I think a lot of times we're a lot more willing to let our heroes make mistakes rather than to have them intentionally do, like we said, morally reprehensible things. So, yeah, because they both have consequences in different ways, but it's okay to let your character be that intentional, do that bad thing and not just have them constantly make mistakes or failures.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's important. Writing a purely sympathetic protagonist can be great, but then I find I'm looking for ways in which to have her screw up and be human and, make those mistakes. But sometimes we need them to choose wrong, to to do the bad thing and not just the oops thing. Right, and to be human, and then to have the lesson that comes out of that, or the consequences that come out of that. I mean, maybe the character never learns the lesson, but in thinking about Evelyn, so Alice is, Evelyn is in the school for the feeble-minded. It's 1927, so I'm using language of the era. And Alice has Down syndrome. And, that wasn't understood. It wasn't encountered much back then. Evelyn never knew anybody like this before just now, and she's very uncomfortable. She just doesn't know how to relate to Alice. And so after this event, when Evelyn has her shift, it's going to set her up for being much more understanding and sympathetic toward people with differences down the road as a mature person. Right now Evelyn's only 15. She's been going through a lot. This is all new for her. So her act is quite reprehensible. But then you have to layer in all of these circumstances and what she's just been through and, lots of other things. And then think about, where do I go from here? What does it mean to my character arc, to my plot, to my reader?
Yeah, and in NLP, neurolinguistic terms, one of the presuppositions is that everything everybody does makes perfect sense to them at the time. And for some morally reprehensible acts, it's the only choice that people believe they have, which is why we have people who are imprisoned, because they've contravened moral laws that the human race won't find unacceptable. Yet at the time, presumably they felt that was the only choice available to them, was to kill someone they loved, or to something horrific. Now it's going to be hard to turn that person into a hero or heroic protagonist, so that's obviously one extreme. But I think if you can think about your character's motivations and why that then makes perfect sense to them, not necessarily, I mean, if it's a snap thing, like someone trespassing, then obviously that's a difficult thing they're not necessarily going to reflect on it in the moment, but that's where that combination of the flaw, the emotional wound, the motivation that they may have, even if it's unconscious, and then the fact that that's going to make sense to them as their best available choice, either their only available choice or the best of two bad choices. So what do they do? If she doesn't snap at the person trespassing, does she then leave herself open to more vulnerability? And so there's that choice.
Right.
So it reads morally reprehensible to us, but from the character's point of view, it made perfect sense.
Right. Yeah, it does. And she's not even thinking about it in logical terms, but if you go deep down in the psyche into that sort of emotional subconscious territory, it does make sense because of the triggers that lead her to this act. So is it her only choice logically, rationally? No, of course not. But is it her only possible reaction in that moment? Yeah, it feels true.
And I just thought of another example as well, from a movie, but everyone will know this one, with the famous Indiana Jones scene in the market where up until that moment he's fought everybody with fists and knives and things like that, and he just gets fed up and pulls the gun out and just shoots the bad guy and he's coming at him with the sword. And in a way, it's a moment where we laugh, but it's a tragic moment, really, and he does something completely unexpected. Maybe it's not necessarily morally reprehensible, but he's got away with it with the audience because you've followed this gutsy street brawler all the way through, and that you think, oh Jesus, how much more does he have to suffer? And then all of a sudden he does something that is unexpected. So I think you could combine, if again it's that emotional bank account, if you've seen enough of how they behave and then you want them to behave out of character. Because at the moment we've sort of said, well, it has to be kind of in character or at least explainable. But maybe you want them to do something completely out of character. There has to be a way for the reader to then either go, Yeah, fair enough. That's going. I'll pay that. That's okay that they did that because I've been with them all this way in that journey, and it's pushed them over the edge, maybe, or whatever. And so that's why it comes to mind with that Indiana Jones scene, because it's sort of like it's pushed him over the edge.
Right, like a snap moment, like your character has broken.
Yeah. And you haven't telegraphed it, you haven't flagged it at all. But again, we've spent time with them, and so maybe that's another key as well. There, if you just too early, might be too bad.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that like emotional breakdown moment. I think as readers, we all identify with like a character in crisis having like a breakdown moment, right? Like even if it's completely out of character, like we all have been to that point where we're teetering on the edge of just chaos in our own life. And so it's okay for us, like sometimes we watch this character go through hell, right? Because as authors, we're putting our character through hell.
Right.
And so a reader will allow for like, oh, okay, that character just broke, snapped, did something completely awful and terrible, but they did it because they'd reached the complete end of themselves. And we've all kind of hit that at various lives.
Yeah, I like that phrase, reached the complete end of themselves. That's a great line. Yeah.
And also, I think, Alida, you said it well, that you want consequences too. So if you have pushed your reader into a point where they're starting to feel some distaste about what the character just did, if the consequences then land in a believable way, or even better still, obviously, really tie into where the plot and the story is going, then that's, I think, quite delicious actually. Is when that sort of things happen.
Poetic justice.
Right.
Yeah, or even just evolution.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I did write in a scene in which Evelyn kind of makes amends or redeems herself, but in doing that, it had to be appropriate to her bad act. It also had to be subtle. I didn't want to browbeat my character or my reader or shoehorn a lesson into the story.
Right.
So Evelyn makes a very quiet but meaningful gesture toward Alice, after she kind of realizes how much she hurt this girl's feelings. And that's it. I don't want to bring it up again. I don't want to analyze it. I don't want Evelyn to talk to her friend about it. It just needs to sit with the reader and be what it's going to be. And I think we all have moments in our life where they're far enough in our past we've forgotten about them, but if they pop up, we're like, ooh, right? Ooh, cringe. Did I really say that or do that? And but then the moment still needs to ripple throughout the rest of the book. It can't just drop off the page. Like, she did a thing, she made an amends. Done. Right? Because that's the whole point of the character arc, is that it is an arc through the entirety of the story.
Right.
So, subtly, without browbeating anybody, I hope that readers will see the connection, the meaning that this has in her life going forward. Let's just kind of recap. Should our protagonist do bad things? Is it a requirement of making your character real and three-dimensional, or is it enough for them just to make mistakes once in a while and,
I think you should do it.
I think some of it depends on the genre conventions, I think, to some degree, because obviously in a thriller, the kind of level of morally reprehensible is maybe far greater in terms of what we're pushing in terms of acceptance than, say, a Christian love story. So, but yeah, obviously you want I think it's important that a protagonist has to be flawed. I've written Mary Sue before and had feedback from editors saying, everything comes too easily to them. And okay, right, yeah, got it. So not only do I need more conflict, but you need crisis in there. You need difficult decisions they need to make, and then sometimes those decisions are going to be wrong decisions. And
right.
Presumably, a lot of the time through the story, they are going to be wrong decisions.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the story would have ended.
Yeah.
So to some degree, we're always throwing them into a position where they could make a bad decision. But what you're saying is, when do we push that over the line to make it something that, as is cringeworthy, or
right.
And I think you've got to be choosy about those. You really have to pick those moments, and maybe it doesn't need to appear in this particular story writing, but in some, like George R.R. Martin's, clearly it's part of the psyche.
Yeah, I think you're right that we need to be choosy about when and how many of these moments. I would not say every story needs one, but I want to touch on what you were saying about genre, Robert. I think that's another really good point. If your protagonist is a mafia kingpin, readers aren't going to care that he's, throwing someone in the river chained to a cinder block. It just goes with the territory. But if you establish that he's also a great family man, and then if he cheats on his wife later in the story, that might be the thing where he's done bad, right? Yeah. So doing bad for your character, it's very specific to the story you're telling. If you're writing, a middle grade book about a couple of girl best friends, somebody spilling a secret could be doing bad. So the scale and the incident has to be appropriate to your character and to your story.
Or tormenting their pet or something, so it's...
Don't do that.
That's worse.
Yeah.
Worse. It's pets and children are the things that you should never do.
Right.
Yeah, but especially pets.
I was going to say that you should use it as part of the growth within your character arc, because your character arc is growing your character, right? You want them to go from point A to point B, getting presumably better. As a human being, as a, whatever, as a parent, as a father, as a, whatever you want to choose. So if that morally reprehensible moment happens and they grow from it, then that, I think, can really enhance both your character arc and your thematic content.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a powerful tool, I think, to allow them to make those bad choices, can really enhance that growth and that thematic content.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.